He buys the sleek two-seater he's wanted since boyhood and drains the family savings. She sells it in a single surgical day and replaces it with an SUV that actually fits their life as silence settles his pride and her patience collide. Can a practical car carry them back to trust? When I was a kid, I used to think that owning a sports car meant you had officially made it in life. It was the kind of dream that stuck with me from the days I used to sit on the curb outside my uncle's garage watching him polish his cherry red convertible until the sunlight bounced off its hood like fire. That car symbolized freedom to me. It was the sound of the engine starting after a long week at work and the promise that for at least one stretch of open road you could be whoever you wanted to be. Somewhere between growing up and turning into a husband and father, that dream got pushed aside under more practical things like mortgages, school lunches, and oil changes for a family sedan that always seemed to need something replaced. My wife Mia and I had talked for months about getting a bigger vehicle, a proper SUV that could fit us and the kids without feeling like we were playing a game of human Tetris every time we packed up for a trip. We even started a savings account just for that purpose. It was the responsible plan, and I was proud of how committed we both were to it. Then came a Saturday morning that changed everything. I was supposed to be running errands while Mia took the kids to her mother's house. The dealership sat across from the grocery store and I had no intention of stopping by. But there it was. A black two-seater with the roof folded back and a sales tag that said clearance for immediate sale. I told myself I was just going to look. The next thing I knew, I was sitting behind the wheel listening to the salesman talk about torque and handling and how this particular model was discontinued so I'd never find another one like it. He was good at his job and I was weak in that moment. The truth is, I didn't buy that car because it was logical. I bought it because for a few minutes I felt like the version of myself I used to imagine I'd become. I wanted to feel young again, even if it was just behind a steering wheel. I convinced myself it was harmless, that we could rebuild the savings quickly, that Mia would understand once she saw how happy I looked driving it. That's what I told myself while signing the papers and draining the account we had built together. When I brought the car home, Mia wasn't back yet. The driveway caught the afternoon sun, and I stood there admiring it, feeling an unfamiliar pride that was also mixed with unease. It gleamed beautifully, but it also looked out of place next to the chalk drawings on the sidewalk and the stack of plastic scooters leaning against the garage wall. I took a deep breath, thinking I could justify it somehow when Mia returned. Maybe I'd tell her it was an investment. Maybe I'd tell her it was temporary. Maybe she'd even like it. She didn't. That night, after the kids went to bed, we sat at the kitchen table in silence long enough to hear the clock ticking against the wall. She didn't yell, but her disappointment cut deeper than any argument could have. She asked me why I would do something like that without talking to her first. I didn't have a good answer. I mumbled something about needing a change, about feeling stuck and wanting to do something for myself for once. She just nodded and looked down at her hands. For the next few days, the car sat in the driveway like a monument to my impulsiveness. The kids called it Daddy's silly car because there were no back seats. Mia avoided talking about it altogether. I thought the silence meant things were slowly cooling off, but now I realize silence in marriage is rarely neutral. It's a signal. It's the calm that comes before something decisive. I didn't know what she was planning, but I could sense it. There was a steadiness in how she moved around the house that week, a kind of quiet purpose that made me uneasy. I told myself she just needed time to forgive me, yet part of me knew she was thinking about what this choice said about me, about us, and about the future we were supposed to be building together. That Friday, I came home from work and the driveway was empty. At first I thought she had taken the car to get groceries, but when I opened the garage, the SUV wasn't there either. The only thing in the space where my sports car had been was a folded piece of paper taped to the wall with my name written neatly across it. And that's when I started to understand that maybe I wasn't the only one capable of making bold decisions without permission. I stood there in the garage staring at that folded piece of paper like it might explain everything if I just waited long enough. My name written in Mia's careful handwriting almost looked polite, which somehow made it worse. I unfolded it and read her note in silence, the words steady and composed, as if she had rehearsed them a dozen times in her head before writing them down. She said she couldn't keep watching me chase after something that belonged to another version of our lives, a version that didn't include car seats or backpacks or grocery lists. She said she had taken care of the car situation and that I should trust her. That was all. No anger, no insults, just finality. I went outside again, half expecting the car to appear, as if I had misread the note. The empty space in the driveway made my stomach tighten. I checked the bank app on my phone and saw a new transaction, a deposit that looked suspiciously like the exact amount I'd paid for the sports car. My chest tightened as I realized what she had done. I called her right away. She answered after several rings, sounding calm, almost too calm. I asked her where the car was. She said she sold it. Just like that. I didn't know what to say. I stood there holding the phone to my ear, listening to her breathing, while my thoughts scrambled for something that would make sense of this. Finally, I asked how she even managed to sell it so quickly. She told me she found a buyer online who paid cash because he had been looking for that model for months. She said she met him at the dealership with all the paperwork. She had even gotten a better deal than what I paid, which was somehow more humiliating than the fact that she sold it at all. When I asked her what she did with the money, she told me she used it to buy an SUV that actually fit all of us. She said it quietly, but there was an edge under her voice, like she was tired of explaining the obvious. She said it was parked in her mother's driveway for now until I cooled off. Then she hung up. I spent that night pacing the kitchen. Every few minutes I'd glance out the window at the empty driveway again. I felt betrayed, but I also felt something worse than anger. I felt ashamed. Because beneath the frustration was the sharp awareness that she hadn't done it out of spite. She had done it to fix what I broke. That realization made it hard to stay mad, even though my pride wanted to. The next morning I went to her mother's house. The SUV was there in the driveway, shiny and practical, with enough room to carry the whole family and still have space for groceries. It was exactly what we had talked about buying months ago. When Mia came out, she didn't look triumphant. She just looked tired. She told me the kids loved it and that maybe now we could start acting like a family again. Her words weren't meant to hurt, but they landed like a stone in my chest. Driving back home alone, I realized how much the car had really represented for me. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of something I thought I'd lost when I became a husband and father. That car was my attempt to hold on to a feeling I hadn't outgrown but should have learned to live without. I had wanted freedom, but I hadn't noticed that I already had it in a different form. Freedom from loneliness. Freedom from drifting aimlessly. I had just traded that for an engine and a moment of pride. For the next few days, I tried to justify my feelings. I told myself she shouldn't have done it behind my back, that she should have waited for me to agree, but deep down I knew I had set the precedent. I was the one who had broken our agreement first. She just mirrored what I did, only with more logic and less selfishness. Still, it hurt. Not because of the money or the car, but because it made me realize how fragile our trust had become. For the first time since we got married, I wasn't sure she saw me as her partner anymore. I felt like a problem she had to solve quietly because talking to me wouldn't work. That week was quiet between us. She stayed with the kids at her mother's for a few days, and I stayed in the house that suddenly felt too large for one person. Every sound echoed differently. I tried to sleep but kept waking up at odd hours, thinking about the car, the sale, the note. I began to notice small things like how she had left her favorite mug in the sink, or how the living room light flickered faintly when no one was there to turn it off. One night I went out to the empty garage and sat on the cold concrete floor, staring at the oil stains that marked where my sports car used to be. I realized that what I missed wasn't the car itself, but the illusion that I could still be someone else, someone who didn't have responsibilities heavier than a steering wheel. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that Mia wasn't the one who had betrayed our trust. But realizing that didn't fix anything. It only left me with the uncomfortable truth that I might have already lost more than just a car. The next weekend I decided to drive to her mother's house again, though I waited until I was sure the kids would be down for their afternoon nap. I didn't tell her I was coming because I knew that if I warned her, she might find a reason not to see me. I parked at the edge of the street and sat there for a long time, watching the curtains shift in her mother's living room. The SUV was in the driveway, glinting faintly in the sunlight, looking almost smug in its quiet practicality. I sat there thinking about how easily she had replaced the sports car with something sensible and right for our family. It was what we had needed all along, yet it made me feel like I had been edited out of my own life. Eventually I got out and knocked on the door. Her mother opened it and gave me that cautious smile people use when they are trying not to take sides. She said Mia was in the backyard hanging laundry and that I could talk to her if I wanted. I thanked her and walked through the kitchen, where I could still smell the faint trace of coffee. The backyard looked the same as it had when we were dating, except now there were two tiny shirts flapping on the clothesline next to hers. She looked up when she heard the screen door creak, but she didn't look surprised. She just nodded slightly like she had been expecting me. I told her I wasn't there to argue. I said I just wanted to understand how we got here. She kept folding a towel while I talked, which somehow made it easier to keep my voice steady. I told her I knew I had been reckless and selfish. I said I didn't buy that car because I wanted to hurt her. I bought it because I wanted to feel like myself again, and I didn't realize that the self I was trying to find didn't exist anymore. She listened quietly, and when I finished she said that she believed me. But she also said that believing me didn't make the consequences disappear. She said she had felt invisible for a long time, like she was living next to me instead of with me. When I took that money and bought the car, it wasn't about the car itself. It was about how easily I could make a decision that erased her from it. Her words stayed in the air between us, heavier than anything I could have said in return. I told her she was right. There was nothing else to say. We stood there in silence, watching the laundry move in the wind. After a while she said she didn't want to fight anymore, but she also didn't know if she could trust me again. She said that the SUV wasn't about revenge, but about reclaiming something stable for the kids, for herself, for us, if there was still an us left to reclaim. I drove back home with that sentence running through my mind on repeat. If there was still an us left to reclaim. I kept thinking about what that meant, about how fragile a marriage can be when the foundation of trust starts to crumble. You can live together under the same roof, eat the same dinners, share the same bed, and still feel like strangers if honesty isn't there. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table where she had once sat across from me during our first big argument years ago, when we were newly married and broke but still hopeful. I realized that we had stopped having real conversations somewhere along the way. We had replaced them with short updates about bills and errands and kids' schedules. We talked around each other instead of to each other. The car wasn't the beginning of that silence, but it was the breaking point that revealed how wide the distance had grown. The next day I called her and asked if she could meet me for coffee somewhere neutral. She hesitated before agreeing. We met at a quiet cafe downtown where we used to go when we were still dating. The place hadn't changed much, though the chairs were older and the menu shorter. When she walked in, she looked like someone who had aged a little from all the exhaustion we had put each other through. I probably looked worse. I told her I wanted to rebuild her trust, but I didn't know how. She said the first step would be learning to talk before acting, which sounded simple but felt enormous. I told her I wanted to sell something else, the house maybe, or one of the smaller savings accounts, to make up for what I had spent. She shook her head and said it wasn't about money. It was about whether I could start showing that I saw her not just as my wife but as my partner again. We talked for nearly an hour, mostly about practical things like the kids' school and the upcoming holidays, but it felt strangely healing just to talk without tension. When we left, she didn't promise anything, but she said she would bring the kids home the next day. She said we would take things slowly. That night, I cleaned the garage for the first time in months. I swept the floor and cleared the space where the sports car had been. I imagined the new SUV sitting there instead of the one that had made me feel like someone I wasn't. It felt like preparing the space for a second chance, though I didn't know if I deserved it. As I turned off the light and closed the door, I couldn't help wondering if the hardest part of growing older isn't losing the things we dreamed about, but learning to let go of the versions of ourselves who believed those dreams were the only path to happiness. I wasn't sure if Mia and I would make it back to what we once were, but for the first time in a long time I felt ready to try instead of run. Mia brought the kids home the next day, and the house filled with the sounds I had been missing, though the space between us still felt careful and stiff, and I tried to keep my movements quiet, as if noise alone could tip us back into an argument that neither of us wanted. That evening after they went to bed, she set a thin folder on the kitchen table and told me she wanted me to see the full picture, and then she went upstairs to read to our daughter, so I sat in that chair and opened the folder like a student waiting for a grade he already suspected might not be pretty. Inside were copies of emails and a receipt and a handwritten list in her neat block letters, and as I read through them the week replayed in a different light, and the ache in my chest shifted from wounded pride into something closer to remorse for not having asked the right questions sooner. The first page was an email thread with a dealership out by the river where we used to take the kids to throw pebbles and get snow cones in the summer, and in that thread I saw our names on a pending order for an SUV with a hold fee paid 2 weeks before I went rogue with the sports car. There was a note from a sales manager explaining that our hold would expire if the balance was not finalized by Friday morning, And there was another note saying the model we wanted had been hard to keep in stock because of a backlog, so the hold was a courtesy that would not be extended again. The receipt showed the hold fee paid with her own little freelance account that she keeps for seasonal side work, and that I had long treated as her hobby money because I never realized how many nights she spent at the dining room table finishing up extra projects after I went to sleep. Another paper was a note from our son's teacher, and it took the wind out of me in a way that no argument could. During the busiest dismissal day, she had pulled Mia aside and said that our son had been anxious about rides to activities because our car did not fit his gear and he worried he might make us late every time, and that he had said he missed when we all rode together without a debate about who sat where. There was a short entry from the school counselor who had met him after a nervous stomach spell, and it explained that routines help kids feel safe, and that reliable transportation is part of that routine, and reading those lines felt like stepping on a hidden nail because I had been so focused on the fantasy of freedom that I ignored the most basic kind of security. Then came a picture printed from Mia's phone of our old sedan loaded for a weekend visit with her mother, and in the photo the stroller is wedged at an angle and the diaper bag sits half open and the booster seat leans just enough to make my gut clench, and in the corner is the reflection of Mia's face in the window, and she looks tired in a way I had not seen because I had not looked closely. There was also a letter from the bank with a dull official tone stating that our automatic mortgage payment would try to pull on Monday, and that the account balance was hovering a hair above the threshold after my purchase, and I realized she had sold the sports car not just for principal but because the clock on that letter was ticking loudly in her ears while I was still standing in the driveway admiring something shiny. The last page was the list in her handwriting, and it was not a ledger of punishments for me, though some part of me felt I deserved one, and instead it was a simple cascade of tasks she had raced through on that Friday. Call dealership to ask if the hold can be saved. Ask neighbor to watch kids for an hour. Drive to sports car buyer and handle paperwork. Deposit cash. Clear mortgage pull. Finalize SUV. Return before bedtime. There was a little box ticked off beside each task, and the rhythm of those lines told a different story than the one I had been telling myself all week. She had not been trying to win. She had been trying to keep the ship from taking on water while I was standing on deck wondering why the stars looked dimmer than they used to. I sat there a long time with my hands flat on the folder, and I replayed the day I had bought the sports car, and I could see every small moment where a different choice could have lived. I could have called her from the lot and asked her to talk me down. I could have remembered the conversation about the hold that I had half listened to while scrolling my phone. I could have thought of our son and his nervous stomach and our daughter's tiny backpack that never seems to close. What I felt then was not just regret but a quiet and heavy gratitude that she had chosen to act rather than watch us stumble, and that she had absorbed the weight of it without tossing that weight across the table at me when she easily could have. When she came back downstairs, I did not try to defend what I had done because there was nothing left to defend. I told her I had read everything, and I told her I finally understood, and then we stood there in a hush that felt new because it was not fragile or sharp. It was the kind of hush that happens after a storm when even the air feels rinsed. She did not say "I told you so," and I realized that those words would have been a smaller victory than the one she was after. She wanted a partner who saw the whole picture, not a husband who won an argument about a machine. We went out to the garage and stood in the space that had become a little theater for my mistakes, and then she hit the button on the fob and the new SUV out front chirped and flashed, and she said she was ready to bring it home if I was ready to treat it like our shared plan rather than her corrective measure. I took a breath that felt like the first real one I had taken in days, and I said I was ready, and I meant it because it was the only honest answer left. I still wondered if this understanding would be enough to rebuild what I had cracked, since trust takes longer to mend than a set of keys takes to turn, but as we moved boxes to make room for the SUV, I noticed a cardboard tube tucked behind a shelf, and inside was a rolled map with highlighter lines that traced a loop through state parks and little towns with pie shops and lakes, and she said she had marked it late at night during the hold week, and she had labeled it First Family Road Trip, and that little map made my throat go tight in a way I did not expect because it was a picture of the life we were meant to be building. We set the tube on the workbench and turned back to the driveway, and for the first time the sight of a practical vehicle felt like a promise rather than a sentence, and yet there was still one question I had not asked her about the SUV and what she had traded to secure it, and I knew I had to hear that answer before I could be sure we were truly ready to move forward. Later that evening, after the kids were asleep, I asked her what I had been carrying in my mind all day. We were sitting at the dining table again, though this time the folder was gone, replaced by a mug of tea that was starting to cool between her hands. I told her I needed to know what she had given up to buy the SUV because the numbers on the account didn't add up. There had been more money involved than what the car sale covered, and I could not shake the thought that she had sacrificed something else to make up the difference. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she traced a finger along the edge of the cup as if she was choosing her words carefully. Then she told me that when the buyer handed her the cash, she knew it still wasn't enough to clear the mortgage pull and pay for the new vehicle, so she used the last of her freelance savings to cover the rest. She said it softly, but the simplicity of that admission hit me like a heavy door closing. That account had been her safety net, the little space that was hers alone, the one thing she could rely on without checking with anyone, and she had drained it to keep us from falling behind. I asked her why she didn't tell me sooner, and she said that at the time she didn't think I would understand. She said she had watched me chase so hard after symbols of freedom that she didn't think I was capable of seeing what real freedom looked like anymore. Real freedom, she said, was knowing that our family wouldn't wake up one morning and lose the roof over our heads because of a reckless choice. I sat there listening while the words landed one by one, and I realized how much heavier her kind of courage was compared to mine. I tried to tell her that I wanted to make it right, that I would find a way to refill that account even if it meant selling a few things or taking on extra shifts. She smiled faintly but said she didn't want repayment, she wanted partnership. She said the money wasn't what she had lost, it was the sense that we were on the same side. I told her I understood, though part of me knew that understanding was only the first step and not the last. Over the next few weeks we began to find a rhythm again, though it was quieter and slower than before. I stopped pretending that small decisions didn't matter, and she stopped keeping everything bottled up behind polite silence. Every evening we took short drives with the kids in the new SUV, exploring side roads that I had never paid attention to before. The vehicle didn't roar like the sports car had, but it carried a kind of peace that I hadn't realized I was craving. There was something steady about the sound of the engine, the soft hum that made conversations feel easier. One night, after we got home from one of those drives, we sat in the garage for a while, with the doors open, watching the streetlights flicker across the hood. She mentioned that the kids had started calling it the adventure car, and that our daughter had asked if we could sleep in it one night during a camping trip. The way she said it made me laugh quietly because I could picture it clearly, our son kicking his blanket off halfway through the night while our daughter whispered stories in the dark. That image felt more satisfying than any open road I had once imagined behind a sports car wheel. I started to notice other changes in myself too. I stopped checking car websites during lunch breaks and instead found myself reading about budget planning or simple home repairs. It wasn't that I had lost my love for beautiful machines, but rather that I had begun to see them for what they really were, just machines, not cures for restlessness. The real restlessness had always been about wanting proof that I still mattered beyond the roles of husband and father, and I had gone looking for that proof in the most foolish place possible. A few weeks later, Mia surprised me by showing me a small wooden box she kept in her closet. Inside were ticket stubs from trips we had taken years ago before the kids and some photos I had forgotten existed. She said she had started collecting small reminders of good moments again because she wanted to remember why we had worked so hard to build this life. I told her I wanted to start adding to that box too, and she said that would mean the world to her. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a quiet renewal of vows that didn't need ceremony or witnesses. As winter turned to spring, the tension that had hung between us began to fade into something softer, though it never disappeared completely. Every so often I'd catch her looking at me with that measuring expression that people have when they are deciding if they can trust again, and each time I hoped that I had given her enough reason to say yes. Still, there was one more layer to all of this that I hadn't confronted. Beneath the guilt and the gratitude, I felt something else stirring, a question about why I had felt so unseen in the first place, and whether that was something she could fix or something I had to face on my own. I realized that before we could fully move forward, I would have to understand what had driven me to that dealership in the first place, because if I didn't name it, I might just find another way to repeat it. So one evening after the kids were asleep and the house was quiet again, I sat down with a notebook and tried to write it all out, everything that had led me to that impulsive purchase and everything I had learned since. It was slow and clumsy, but as I filled the pages, I started to see the pattern more clearly, and what I saw there wasn't just about cars or money or even marriage. It was about the uneasy space between who I thought I would become and who I actually was. When I finished writing, I realized that the twist in all this wasn't just that Mia had been right or that I had been wrong. The twist was that we had both been standing on opposite sides of the same fear, afraid that we had already lost the versions of ourselves that used to make us feel alive. We just chased the feeling in different ways. That realization would come to change everything about how I saw her and how I saw myself, but it would take another unexpected moment before it finally sank in for good. The moment that changed everything came one Saturday morning when the kids had convinced Mia to take them to a park near the river. I offered to stay home and fix a loose shutter on the upstairs window, but the truth was I just wanted a quiet house for an hour or two to think. I made coffee and sat by the kitchen window watching the street that had become the background to our lives. It struck me how ordinary everything looked and how much meaning lived inside that ordinariness. I wondered if that was what maturity really meant, not the absence of excitement but the ability to see beauty in the stillness. When the sound of the garage door opened, I assumed Mia had forgotten something. I walked down the hall and froze because instead of Mia it was a tow truck backing up carefully into the driveway. My first thought was that there had been some mistake, maybe a payment had bounced, but when the driver stepped out he held an envelope with my name on it. He told me he had been asked to deliver a package, not to pick anything up. I signed for it and he left before I could ask any questions. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper folded twice and a small silver key. The note was in Mia's handwriting. It said she wanted me to take the SUV and drive somewhere on my own for a day or two. She said she had arranged for her mother to keep the kids overnight. The only instruction was to drive with no music and no destination, just to follow wherever the road felt right. She wrote that she wanted me to see the world again, but through different eyes this time. At first I thought it was some kind of test, but curiosity won out. I packed a small bag, grabbed my notebook, and left. The day was overcast but not cold, and the highway stretched out like an open question waiting for an answer. I drove for hours without a plan, passing through small towns with shuttered diners and quiet gas stations. The hum of the SUV felt steady and forgiving, as if it was built to absorb the restless noise I carried inside me. Somewhere past the third exit, I started to understand what she wanted me to feel. The car wasn't fast like the sports car, but it had a kind of patience in how it handled curves and small hills. There was no rush, no need to prove anything. I found myself breathing easier. I stopped at a roadside fruit stand where an old man was selling jars of honey. He asked where I was headed, and I told him honestly I didn't know. He said that sounded like the best kind of trip. I kept driving until evening and ended up near a lake I hadn't visited since college. The water was still and dark, and the air smelled faintly of pine. I parked the car and sat by the shore until the sun dipped low behind the trees. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about work or bills or mistakes. I was just present. It was strange how simple that feeling was and how long it had been since I had let myself feel it. I pulled out my notebook and started writing again, not about guilt this time, but about gratitude. I wrote about Mia's patience and the way she had found balance where I had created chaos. I wrote about our children and how they had unknowingly become my compass even when I was too lost to admit it. I wrote about the SUV and how it had somehow turned into a quiet symbol of everything we were trying to rebuild. When I finished writing, I tore out the page and folded it into the glove compartment. I told myself I'd show it to her one day, but not yet. It needed to sit there for a while like a small secret between the car and me. When I got home the next evening, the house was warm with the smell of something baking. The kids ran to the door shouting about how they had built a pillow fort with their grandmother. Mia smiled when she saw me, though her expression was cautious, as if she was waiting to hear how the trip had gone. I told her it was good, and she nodded like she already knew. Then she said quietly that maybe now we could start planning that first family road trip, the one she had mapped out months ago. Over the next few days, we began to talk about routes and small towns to visit. The kids drew pictures of what they wanted to see and taped them to the fridge. Every evening, I added one more practical item to the list: sleeping bags, a cooler, spare tires. The planning itself felt healing. There was a rhythm to it, like we were stitching something back together piece by piece. A few nights later, after everyone went to bed, I went to the garage again and opened the glove compartment. I unfolded the page and read it under the dim light. The words felt raw but true. I walked back inside and placed the page in the small wooden box that Mia kept on the shelf with the ticket stubs and photos. It felt right to add it there because this too was a piece of our story. That weekend, Mia found the note and asked if I meant every word. I told her yes, every single one. She didn't say anything for a while, then she said she thought she could trust me again. She didn't say it like a declaration, more like a quiet truth she had tested and found solid. Still, I couldn't help feeling there was one more step we needed before we could call it whole again. We had learned to rebuild, but we hadn't yet celebrated what we had rebuilt. I wanted a way to remind her that this wasn't just recovery but renewal. So I started planning something small, something just for us. I didn't tell her yet because I wanted the surprise to mean something more than flowers or apologies. I wanted it to show that I finally understood what partnership really looked like. I didn't know it yet, but that gesture would bring the story full circle in a way I hadn't expected. The idea for the surprise started as a quiet thought that grew stronger every day. I watched her load the kids into the SUV with that steady patience she had carried through the worst of our storm. I wanted to give something back to her, but this time not a thing with horsepower or a price tag, but a moment that would say more than any apology could. So one evening while she was putting the kids to bed, I went out to the garage and pulled the cardboard tube with her old road trip map from the shelf. I spread it across the hood of the SUV under the dim light and started tracing a new route in pencil, one that ended at the lake where I had driven alone on that overcast day. Over the next few days I kept planning in small stolen moments. I packed a basket with her favorite snacks, the ones she always claimed she didn't care about but secretly smiled over. I borrowed a blanket from her mother and folded it neatly in the back of the SUV. I didn't want this to be grand or loud. I just wanted her to see that I finally understood what her kind of love looked like. When Saturday came, I woke her early and told her we were going for a drive, just the two of us. The kids stayed with her mother and the morning air smelled faintly of rain, though the sky was clearing. She looked curious but didn't ask questions. As we drove through the same highway I had taken alone a few months earlier, I noticed how different the silence between us felt. It wasn't heavy anymore. It was comfortable, like a shared breath. We reached the lake by mid-morning. I parked in the same spot where I had sat before, but this time I didn't feel lost. I told her I wanted to show her something. I opened the back of the SUV and spread the blanket across the grass. She laughed softly when she saw the basket. We sat down together, watching the light shimmer on the water. I told her this was the same place I had come to when she sent me away that weekend, and how sitting there alone had changed something in me. I told her that I finally understood that freedom wasn't about escape, but about presence, about choosing to stay even when things get hard. She didn't speak right away, but when she turned toward me, her eyes softened in a way that made every rough conversation and sleepless night worth it. She said she was glad I had found what I was looking for, because she had been afraid that part of me would always be somewhere else chasing something I couldn't name. I told her that maybe I had been chasing us all along without realizing it. We stayed there for hours talking about small things like how the kids were growing too fast and how maybe we should plant a small garden behind the house. There was no grand reconciliation speech, just a steady ease that came from knowing we had already done the hard part. As the afternoon faded, she asked if I had kept anything from the sports car. I told her I hadn't, except for one thing. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small metal keychain the dealership had given me the day I bought it. It was shaped like a wheel, no bigger than a coin. I told her that for a while it had felt like a reminder of failure, but that now it reminded me of the turn I had finally made. She smiled and said maybe we could hang it on the rearview mirror of the SUV, not as a trophy but as a reminder of what we had learned. So we did. The drive home was quiet in that peaceful way that long drives can be when no words are needed. The road curved through stretches of sunlight and shadow, and I kept thinking about how strange it was that something as small as a car could unravel and then rebuild so much of our life. The same impulse that once pulled me away from my family had somehow led me back to them. That night, after the kids were asleep, we stood in the garage again, the new SUV resting where the old car had once been. She leaned against the hood and said it finally felt like home again. I told her I agreed. There was still a faint smell of oil and dust in the air, but it no longer felt like guilt. It felt like history, something honest that we had earned. Before we went inside, I looked at the little wheel charm swinging from the mirror and realized that the life I had been chasing had never been about the rush of speed or the hum of an engine. It had always been about having someone beside me who saw the world as worth slowing down for. I don't think I'll ever forget the lesson buried in that season of our marriage. Sometimes you lose things that once defined you so you can make space for what actually matters. Sometimes love doesn't sound like forgiveness. It sounds like a key turning in the ignition of the same car you once took for granted. As we closed the garage door, I caught one last glimpse of the SUV resting in the soft yellow light, and I thought about how peace rarely arrives with a roar. More often it hums quietly, waiting for you to notice that it has been there the whole time.